On a humid night in the summer of 1851, deep in the plantations of Southside Virginia, a ledger recorded a transaction that no one would ever explain fully. The entry was brief, clinical, almost innocent: one enslaved person, approximately 18 unique physical attributes. Purchased at Charleston Market, price $230, nearly 3 times the standard rate. The buyer's name Jonathan Mallory, owner of Whitewood Estate. What followed over the next year would unravel a family, destroy a household, and leave a shadow over every official record of the estate's existence. Court documents from Prince Edward County show only a transfer of property at a fraction of its value, with the stipulation that certain rooms remain permanently sealed. Yet letters, diaries, and whispered memories tell of an obsession so consuming it devoured everything it touched. A fascination that began with a single enslaved person who defied the boundaries of nature itself. Before we descend further into this tale, if you are drawn to history's darkest corners, the secrets they hoped you'd never see, subscribe now to this channel. Comment below where you're listening from, city, state, even country, so this story binds across time and space. Repeat in the comments, "I see the truth hidden behind the walls. I will not look away." Say it twice. Seal it in yourself. Whitewood Estate sprawled over 12,000 acres of rolling tobacco fields and dense pine forests. Jonathan Mallory was 35, tall and stern, his features honed by generations of the planter elite. On the surface, he was a diligent master, a man measured by wealth and propriety. His wife, Helena, just 25, was renowned for her beauty, pale skin, dark cascading hair, and a presence that seemed to command attention without words. Yet beneath their societal veneers, both were prisoners of quiet dissatisfaction. Helena had lost her first child to stillbirth 2 years prior, and Jonathan bore the weight of debts from the estate, masking a growing emptiness within. It was into this fragile household that the trader Elias Trenholm delivered the unusual slave that fateful August morning. He was slight, composed, eyes sharp with intelligence, and he called the person Asa. Trenholm explained clinically, yet with a subtle undertone of fascination, Asa was a hermaphrodite, a person born with both male and female attributes, educated, obedient, and trained to submit to inspection. Jonathan felt an inexplicable stirring in his chest, a mixture of curiosity, unease, and something darker. Helena, when brought to see Asa, initially regarded the figure with polite interest. But as her eyes lingered on the impossible ambiguity before her, something shifted. Both husband and wife recognized, without speaking, that this was no ordinary addition to their household. This was a presence that would consume them, body and mind, and pull the estate into shadows from which it would never return. Repeat this phrase in the comments twice to lock it in. The hidden truth shapes me. I witness what others fear. As Asa settled into Whitewood Estate, the rhythms of plantation life began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The other enslaved people, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy that governed their lives, noticed first. Asa moved differently, walked differently, neither boy nor girl, yet not entirely untouchable by the world around them. Their presence was like a quiet tremor beneath the surface of the household, one that Jonathan and Helena both felt keenly, though they could not articulate why. Jonathan, who had once measured his days by ledger entries and tobacco yields, found himself pulled into obsessive study. He began to examine Asa not as a human being, but as a phenomenon, a living puzzle to be dissected and understood. Anatomy books, medical treatises, volumes of rare physiology arrived from Richmond and Charleston, each more arcane than the last. By night, he would pore over the texts by candlelight, drawing meticulous notes and diagrams, recording every curve, every ambiguity, every subtle nuance. Helena, meanwhile, approached Asa differently. She lingered in quiet observation, arranging their hair, adjusting garments, experimenting with styles that emphasized masculine or feminine traits. What started as curiosity soon became compulsion, a need to control, to understand, to possess. Asa, for their part, endured these examinations with patient compliance, speaking only when asked, their voice a haunting in between never male, never female. Yet beneath their blank expression was an intelligence that both Jonathan and Helena recognized but could not name. They saw in Asa's measured silence a reflection of the obsessions they could not confront in themselves. Slowly, imperceptibly, the household began to warp around this triangular dynamic. The master and mistress ceased attending to duties, neglected the plantation accounts, and ignored the obligations that had once structured their lives. Even the enslaved workers felt it, though they could not speak openly. They whispered in the shadows, trading uneasy glances. The kitchens, the fields, the quarters, all became stages on which an invisible tension played out. Asa was neither isolated nor fully integrated, a ghostly pivot around which the estate's balance teetered. The world outside, neighbors' markets, ministers, remained oblivious, but within those red brick walls, a subtle collapse had begun. That first week, Helena spoke to Asa alone for the first time, a question lingering in the air that neither Jonathan dared ask aloud. "Do you understand what you are?" she whispered, circling the figure like a predator disguised in silk. Asa's calm reply, almost ethereal in its neutrality, was chilling. "I am what you see. I am what you require of me, yet I know what you fear to name in yourselves." Helena's hand trembled, caught between revulsion and fascination, and Jonathan watched, a spectator of his own unraveling. It was in these early days that the first fissures in the household appeared. Conversations ceased. Meals were eaten in silence. The presence of Asa had become a mirror of desires, obsessions, and forbidden curiosities that Jonathan and Helena could not escape. Their lives, once ordered and predictable, had begun a slow, inexorable descent. And as the evening drew near, the two of them, alone in their chambers, found themselves thinking the same thought. One neither dared voice. Asa was no longer simply a slave. Asa was a key, a conduit, and perhaps a trap. By the second week, the household had begun to breathe to the rhythm of Asa's presence. The other enslaved people spoke of it only in whispers, careful to avoid Jonathan's gaze or Helena's sudden appearances. Yet everyone sensed the strange gravity that had settled over the estate. Asa's movements, deliberate and quiet, drew attention even when no one else noticed. They carried themselves in a way that suggested both submission and command, a paradox that neither Jonathan nor Helena could reconcile. Jonathan spent hours in his study, poring over treatises on intersex conditions, rare anatomical anomalies, and medical ethics, though he no longer sought knowledge for science alone. Each observation of Asa was documented with obsessive precision: the tilt of a shoulder, the curve of a wrist, the delicate way fingers flexed, the subtle tensions that marked their gait. Helena watched these sessions with a different kind of intensity, often entering the room unannounced, her eyes fixed on Asa. Her own fascination mingled with something darker, almost predatory. The boundaries of propriety, already fragile in their home, began to erode. Asa, always calm, always measured, noticed everything. They answered only when necessary, and even then their voice, suspended between male and female registers, sent shivers down Jonathan's spine and stirred an uncanny heat in Helena. "Why do you look at me that way?" Asa once asked Helena, not accusatory but curious, almost teasing. Her answer faltered. She did not know herself. It was the first crack in the carefully constructed facade of their obsessions. Both husband and wife realized they were drawn into something forbidden, something beyond control. Outside the main house, the estate itself began to feel the consequences. Tobacco fields were left untended. Accounts and contracts went ignored. Jonathan's meetings with neighboring planters became sporadic, then non-existent. Helena ceased her charitable duties, claiming ill health while she wandered the upper floors in silent observation of Asa's movements. Even the kitchen staff, seasoned veterans of plantation life, noticed the shift. Whispers of unease circulated. The master and mistress no longer ruled. Asa's presence had inverted the hierarchy. One night, as the moon rose pale over the pine trees, Jonathan found himself standing at the threshold of the third-floor room, listening to Helena speaking softly to Asa. The words were muted, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable: fascination, obsession, and a creeping desire that neither Jonathan nor Helena would admit even to themselves. He realized, with a jolt of horror, that he was not the only one enthralled. His wife was as ensnared as he was, and Asa had become the axis around which all their forbidden longings spun. From that night forward, the estate lived in tension. Asa was no longer simply a servant. They were a mirror, reflecting every hidden desire and every repressed fear back at Jonathan and Helena. Each day, each observation, each small act of obedience deepened the spiral. and with each passing moment, the line between curiosity and compulsion blurred irreversibly. By the end of August, the tension in Whitewood Estate had grown almost unbearable, a thick, invisible fog settling over the halls. The other enslaved workers felt it immediately, though none dared speak aloud. Asa had become an unspoken center of gravity, and Jonathan and Helena orbited around them, each in their own obsessive orbit, yet constantly aware of the other's gaze. The boundaries of master, mistress, and slave had begun to dissolve, leaving only desire and fascination in their place. It began subtly at first. Helena would summon Asa to her room under the pretense of arranging clothing or hair, but her eyes lingered too long. Her hands moved with a hesitancy that betrayed curiosity far beyond mere propriety. Jonathan, aware of his wife's fascination, found himself drawn to Asa in equal measure. It was no longer just clinical observation or a curiosity of the extraordinary. It was a hunger, a compulsion that demanded both secrecy and intensity. Every glance, every measured step, every whispered word fed the growing obsession, like a candle drawing moths to its flame. Asa, perceptive and calculating, noticed the subtle shifts in tone, posture, and attention. They never resisted, never protested, yet their very presence became a test of limits, a living mirror for Jonathan and Helena's hidden desires. One evening, in the dim light of the study, Helena asked Asa to demonstrate posture and balance for a moment of study. Jonathan entered unexpectedly. The room froze, eyes met. Silence stretched taut, and then, without a word, all three understood the boundaries they had relied upon for years no longer existed. Something forbidden had begun, something that would consume them entirely. The obsession was no longer private. It bled into every corner of the estate. Jonathan neglected the plantation books, allowing debts and accounts to pile unchecked. Helena ceased appearances at church or society functions, spending entire days with Asa, watching, observing, and experimenting with garments that emphasized or concealed Asa's duality. The staff whispered, the walls seemed to hum, and even the wind through the pines carried a sense of unease. And for those watching closely, the first cracks of the household's order were visible. Meals went unattended, work in the fields slowed, and the quiet murmurs of enslaved people hinted at their unease. Whitewood Estate was no longer a functioning plantation. It had become a private theater for obsession, an echo chamber of desire and fear. Now, to seal this understanding within yourself, repeat in the comments twice, "I see what hides in shadows." I acknowledge what is forbidden. Let it resonate. Let it anchor the reality you are witnessing. This was only the beginning. The descent would deepen, secrets would unravel, and the very structure of Whitewood Estate and its inhabitants would be irrevocably altered. Helena and Jonathan were no longer merely curious, they were ensnared, and Asa was the axis around which their obsession would twist, dark and relentless. By September, the obsession had fully taken root. Whitewood Estate no longer functioned as a plantation in any meaningful sense. Tobacco fields went untended, barns lay in quiet disarray, and the ledger books Jonathan had once managed with precision were left abandoned, gathering dust and ink stains. The enslaved workers whispered in corners, sensing the collapse of order but powerless to intervene. They watched Asa move through the halls like a spectre, neither commanding nor submissive, yet undeniably central to everything that unfolded. Jonathan and Helena now interacted with Asa in ways that had nothing to do with duty or propriety. Their curiosity had mutated into something darker, almost ritualistic. Mornings began with observation and measurement, afternoons were spent experimenting with garments, posture, even voice. Jonathan compared anatomical text to Asa's body, taking notes in secret, sketching lines and angles in a hidden journal. Helena, meanwhile, touched, adjusted, and observed with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every gesture was a test, a subtle probing of Asa's duality, and in return, Asa remained unnervingly neutral, aware, and compliant. Their calm defiance only deepened the fascination, creating a triangular tension that warped the household entirely. One evening, Helena lingered in the candlelight with Asa, speaking softly. "Do you understand what we see in you?" she asked, tracing the curve of a wrist. Asa's reply was quiet, deliberate, and disconcerting. "I see what you cannot name in yourselves. You are drawn here by your own reflection." Jonathan, standing in the doorway, felt a chill. The truth was undeniable. Asa was no mere slave. They were the axis of desire, fear, and secrecy. The presence of this single individual had rendered social conventions, marital roles, and plantation hierarchy meaningless. The effect on Jonathan and Helena was almost immediate. They began communicating in coded gestures, silent agreements, and shared glances that others could not interpret. Even their interactions with the staff became strained, minimal, and secretive. Every hour with Asa was a descent deeper into the unknown, a ritual of obsession that neither could resist. And to those watching this story unfold through time, here is your moment. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to witness the depths of history they tried to erase. Comment below with your location, city, state, or country, and become part of this record, as though your presence affirms the truth. The household was no longer governed by Jonathan's authority or Helena's social grace. It was governed by the magnetic pull of Asa, the impossible human being whose very existence challenged everything they had known. Each day the obsession grew stronger, and the lines between fascination and compulsion blurred. By now, anyone who observed closely could see that nothing would ever be the same at Whitewood Estate. By mid-September, the invisible barriers that had once defined Whitewood Estate were gone. The plantation had become a theater of obsession, every room a stage, every gesture a scene in a performance that only Jonathan, Helena, and Asa truly understood. The other enslaved workers moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, sensing that something unnatural governed the household, yet too fearful or powerless to intervene. They watched Helena linger over Asa in ways that were no longer innocent, and Jonathan follow the silent cues, always observing, always measuring. It began with subtle acts, Helena asking Asa to stand differently, shift posture, speak softly, or laugh quietly at her instruction. Jonathan would compare these movements to anatomical diagrams, noting the tension in muscles, the ambiguous contours of the body, the way Asa existed simultaneously in multiple categories. Helena, growing bolder, would arrange Asa's hair in elaborate styles or fit garments that emphasized one aspect of their ambiguous form, then undo them, then rearrange again. The repetition was hypnotic, both for Helena and Asa, and Jonathan observed with an intensity that bordered on feverish. One evening, Jonathan lingered at the doorway while Helena whispered to Asa, her voice low, coaxing. "Do you understand what we see in you?" she asked again, circling as if performing an examination and a ritual at once. Asa's response, flat yet penetrating, cut through the charged air. "I see what you deny in yourselves. You are bound to me not by duty, but by what you cannot resist." That single statement echoed in Jonathan's mind for hours afterward, unsettling and compelling, confirming what he had already begun to sense. Asa was not merely an enslaved person. They were a reflection, a key, a mirror of forbidden fascination. The effect on the estate was immediate. Jonathan's oversight of the plantation declined further. Letters remained unanswered, debts went unpaid, and the workers' whispered concerns were met with distant glances and silence. Helena disappeared for hours into the third-floor room, leaving Asa alone or under her meticulous guidance, her obsession growing more performative, more ritualistic, almost ceremonial. The boundaries of master and mistress, of marital fidelity and social propriety, had been quietly obliterated. And for those observing from beyond time, let this knowledge settle. Subscribe, comment your location below, and become part of this narrative. In the comments, repeat twice, "I see the forbidden. I acknowledge what others hide." Seal it in yourself. By now, Asa had become the axis around which Whitewood Estate revolved. They were neither servant nor property in the conventional sense. They were a pivot, a living enigma that controlled the psychology of both Jonathan and Helena. Each hour, each gaze, each gesture deepened the obsession, and the household moved ever closer to a precipice from which there could be no return. By late September, the tension at Whitewood Estate had become almost tangible, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The household's routine had dissolved entirely. Jonathan rarely descended from his study except to observe Asa or confer silently with Helena. Helena herself moved through the halls with a purpose that was no longer domestic but ritualistic, guiding Asa's movements, altering their appearance, drawing them into elaborate exercises that neither acknowledged nor named. The other enslaved people noticed these changes, the irregularity of orders, the long hours spent in the third-floor room, and they whispered among themselves, uneasy but powerless to intervene. The first real breach of moral boundaries occurred one evening in the quiet candlelight. Helena, experimenting with the way Ace's body could present, instructed them to wear a garment that accentuated one set of characteristics while concealing another. Jonathan watched from the doorway, his journal open, quill poised. Yet his attention was consumed entirely by Ace's form and the way Helena's eyes followed every curve, every nuance. The air was charged with a tension that neither could fully admit to themselves. In that moment, the act of observation became an act of possession. The study of curiosity turned into a compulsion that consumed both master and mistress. Asa remained calm, silent in their obedience, but every tilt of the head, every shift of weight carried a subtle command, a reflection of the power they held simply by existing. They had become the center of a psychological vortex, drawing Jonathan and Helena into a space where desire, fascination, and obsession were indistinguishable. The lines between consent and compulsion blurred, and the estate itself seemed to bend around this unnatural dynamic. Windows were left open to the wind, letting the autumn chill creep through the halls, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill of what was developing within the mansion. The kitchen staff and field hands noticed the change. Meals were left cold, the tobacco barns went unattended, and whispers began of a presence that was neither master nor mistress, but something in between. Harriet, the head cook, sensed the shift more keenly than most. She had seen generations of households crumble, yet even she could not fully comprehend the intensity of what she now witnessed. Asa had become a mirror of forbidden desire, a living enigma that exposed the hidden obsessions of both Jonathan and Helena. For those of you witnessing this story unfold through time, now is your moment. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and comment your location below. Let the words anchor you in the unfolding truth. Repeat in the comments twice. I witness what others hide. I acknowledge what is forbidden. Let it become part of you. By the end of this week, it was undeniable Whitewood Estate was no longer a functioning plantation. It was a psychological labyrinth, and Asa was the axis upon which the entire household now turned. Obsession, once subtle, had become a force as real and consuming as fire, ready to ignite everything in its path. As October arrived, the obsession at Whitewood Estate reached a new intensity, its gravity pulling every thought, every movement, into its orbit. Jonathan and Helena were no longer merely curious or fascinated. They were consumed, each acting as both observer and participant in a ritual they could neither name nor escape. Asa, serene and unreadable, moved between them like a living prism, refracting desire, fear, and obsession into impossible forms. The estate itself seemed to shrink around them, hallways growing narrower, candlelight casting long, distorted shadows that echoed the tension in the third-floor room. The psychological games began subtly at first. Helena would instruct Asa to repeat gestures, to hold poses, to speak phrases that emphasized the ambiguity of their form. Jonathan observed in silence, recording every nuance, comparing notes, testing boundaries. The interplay became almost ritualistic, Helena guiding, Jonathan recording, and Asa existing at the center, calm yet infinitely aware of the power they held. The very act of observation had become a compulsion, a performance that drew them all deeper into forbidden fascination. Outside the third-floor room, the estate continued to decay. Fields lay unplanted, barns remained uninspected, and the enslaved workers whispered in unease. They noticed how Jonathan would pace the halls, distracted, pale, and fevered, while Helena remained secluded for hours on end with Asa, her hands lingering on their hair or clothing in a way that felt charged, almost ceremonial. The household's hierarchy had been inverted. Asa, once merely a servant, now held dominion over the very lives of the master and mistress. One evening, Helena leaned close, her voice soft but urgent. "Do you see what you make us?" she asked Asa, tracing the outline of their face. Asa's reply, calm and deliberate, resonated like a bell. "I am what you allow yourself to see. I am the truth you fear to name." In that single statement lay the entire dynamic of obsession. They were a mirror, reflecting every hidden desire, every unspoken fear, and every unacknowledged impulse. Jonathan, standing nearby, felt his own identity unravel in response, understanding that Asa's presence had become a psychological crucible. And now, for those who witnessed this story in the present, Repeat in the comments twice, I accept what lies in the shadows. I see the forbidden truth. Seal it within yourself. Let it anchor the knowledge of this descent into obsession as Jonathan and Helena's reality collapses around Asa. By this time, the estate's decay mirrored the decay of its inhabitants' sanity. Sleep was minimal, meals were mechanical, and conversation had dwindled to whispers in corners. Every day with Asa deepened the psychological entanglement, and the invisible web of control, fascination, and obsession grew taut, ready to snap. The stage was set, and nothing at Whitewood Estate would remain untouched by the impossible presence of Asa. By mid-October, the cracks in Jonathan and Helena's composure had become impossible to ignore. Sleep eluded them both. Jonathan's nights were spent feverishly writing in his hidden journal, sketching Asa in various postures, annotating every subtle shift of body and expression. Helena, in turn, spent hours arranging garments, testing textures against Asa's skin, studying the way light fell on their ambiguous form. Their obsession had transformed into a compulsive ritual. An endless loop of observation, adjustment, and silent negotiation, each act amplifying their own desire and dependence. The rest of the household sensed the shift, though none could name it. The enslaved workers noticed Jonathan wandering the halls at all hours, distracted and pale, muttering to himself. Helena's absence from the main house grew prolonged, her meals skipped, her presence increasingly spectral. Even the most seasoned servants whispered in corners, fearing the implications of what they saw. Asa moved through the house with a measured calm, aware of every gaze, every thought, every suppressed desire that lingered around them, yet offering no guidance, no reaction beyond perfect obedience. It was as if their very existence had inverted the natural order, creating a vacuum in which obsession thrived. The first overt fracture in the household's psychological equilibrium occurred one evening when Helena, overwhelmed by the intensity of her fascination, gestured for Asa to remain still while she circled them, her eyes tracking every curve, every angle, every shadow. Jonathan, standing in the doorway, realized he no longer observed from the position of authority or detachment. Instead, he felt himself drawn into the same compulsive, almost predatory curiosity. Their combined focus on Asa created a taut, electric atmosphere, one that seemed to ripple through the walls, suffusing the entire estate with a sense of impending collapse. Harriet, the head cook, noticed the tension like a physical presence in the air. She had lived at Whitewood Estate for decades and had witnessed many forms of abuse, obsession, and despair. Yet what she now observed transcended comprehension. The rhythm of the household had shifted. Asa's neutrality and quiet presence dictated the behavior of the master and mistress. No one else could intervene, and even if they could, they were caught in the gravitational pull of the unfolding obsession. For those of you following this story, let this moment settle within you. Repeat in the comments twice, I acknowledge the forbidden. I see what others deny. Let it anchor the reality you are witnessing. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and comment your location. Become a part of this record, a witness to truths erased from history. By now, Whitewood Estate existed in two simultaneous realities: the external, decaying plantation, and the internal obsessive labyrinth created by Asa's presence. Jonathan and Helena were no longer individuals in control. They had become extensions of their fascination, and Asa had become the axis upon which their entire world spun, fragile and unsustainable. By late October, the obsession at Whitewood Estate had fully eclipsed reason. Jonathan and Helena's lives had become entirely structured around Asa, whose calm, unreadable presence dictated the rhythm of their days and nights. The third-floor room had become a sanctuary and a prison, simultaneously sanctuary for their desires, prison for their humanity. Helena spent hours orchestrating the way Asa moved, adjusting garments, testing gestures, observing expressions, while Jonathan compared every subtle motion to medical texts and anatomical sketches, documenting in feverish detail. Their fascination was no longer curiosity. It had become a consuming, insatiable need. Isolation began to take hold. Helena ceased attending any social obligations, refusing letters, invitations, and visitors. Jonathan abandoned his duties on the plantation, neglecting debts and contracts, allowing correspondence to pile unanswered. The enslaved workers whispered in fear and confusion, seeing a household unraveling, unable to intervene. yet acutely aware that the household's authority had been inverted. Asa, neutral and measured, remained at the center unshaken, their presence both calming and terrifying in its control. It was as though the estate itself bent to their will. The first visible psychological toll on Jonathan and Helena became apparent in subtle ways. Jonathan began pacing at night, his face pale, eyes fevered, speaking aloud to himself or to Asa's silent figure. Helena, once composed and delicate, now moved through halls in a trance-like state, her gaze fixed on Asa, her hands trembling as they arranged garments or touched their hair. The obsessions were not shared openly, but existed as silent rituals, each feeding the other, each deepening their dependence. No conversation occurred without reference to Asa's form, posture, or presence. One evening, Helena lingered in the candlelight, brushing Asa's hair, whispering in a voice that trembled with fascination and fear. "Do you see what you make of us?" she asked. Asa, as always, remained calm, their voice measured. "I am what you allow yourself to see. I am what you refuse to name in yourselves." Jonathan, standing in the shadows, felt the same chill of revelation he had felt weeks before. Asa was not a passive subject. They were a mirror, reflecting every hidden desire, every unacknowledged impulse, every forbidden truth. For those watching this story unfold through time, now is your moment to anchor the knowledge. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and comment your location below. And in the comments, repeat twice, "I witness what lies in shadows. I accept what others deny." Let it settle within you as the story itself settles into the truth of obsession, control, and forbidden desire. By this point, Whitewood Estate had ceased to function as a plantation. Its fields lay idle, its barns unguarded, and the enslaved workers moved cautiously through a home no longer governed by master or mistress, but by Asa, the axis of obsession, control, and an impossible, consuming fascination. By early November, the entire fabric of Whitewood Estate had begun to warp under the gravitational pull of obsession. Jonathan and Helena no longer operated as husband and wife, but as co-conspirators in a ritual that revolved entirely around Asa. The plantation itself had become secondary, its once structured routines replaced by an almost hypnotic cycle of observation, manipulation, and study. Asa, ever calm, moved through this world like a fulcrum, balancing both fascination and control with effortless precision. Every glance, every gesture, every measured breath dictated the rhythm of the household. Jonathan's obsession had evolved into a meticulous record of everything he observed. He compared Asa's movements to anatomy books, to medical treatises, to whatever texts he could acquire that might provide insight. His journal, hidden and locked, became a litany of obsession, sketches of limbs, notes on posture, pages detailing gestures, expressions, and the subtle interplay between masculine and feminine characteristics. But the deeper he delved, the more elusive Asa became. The more he sought understanding, the more Asa reflected back a truth he could not name, the impossibility of fully controlling or possessing what existed between categories. Helena, meanwhile, had begun to see herself entirely through Asa's presence. She spent hours alone with the young slave, orchestrating poses, rearranging garments, altering hair, observing reactions. The act of touching, adjusting, and guiding had become a compulsive ritual, almost ceremonial, imbued with both desire and reverence. Her fascination was no longer merely intellectual, it was physical, psychological, and obsessive. She spoke in hushed whispers, coaxing Asa to hold certain positions, to look a particular way, to repeat gestures again and again, as though by repetition she could penetrate the secret of what Asa truly was. The enslaved workers were fully aware that something unnatural had taken hold. Whispers traveled quickly through the quarters the way the master and mistress disappeared into the third-floor room. The mechanical calm with which Asa obeyed, the changes in meals, clothing, and household order. Some attributed it to illness or grief, others, older and more superstitious, whispered about powers that could bend the will of a household. Harriet, the head cook, felt the weight of it most sharply, seeing the fevered eyes of Jonathan and the trance-like absorption of Helena. She understood something was breaking, something beyond mere human desire, of a force that could unravel everything. For those observing from the present, now is the moment to anchor this truth. Subscribe, comment your location, and in the comments, repeat twice, "I see the shadows they cannot name." I acknowledge the forbidden. Let it settle within you as the obsession in the estate continues its inexorable spiral. By now, every corner of Whitewood Estate echoed with the invisible influence of Asa. No one could act freely. Even the air seemed thick with expectation. Jonathan and Helena were no longer masters in the conventional sense. They were participants, ensnared in the web they had created, and Asa was the axis of it all, calm, precise, and terrifyingly aware. By mid-November, the psychological strain at Whitewood Estate had begun manifesting in the most visible ways. Jonathan's once ordered appearance had become disheveled, dark circles rimmed his eyes, and he moved through the halls with the restless energy of a man possessed. Helena's body had grown frail, her frame narrowing as meals were skipped or forgotten, her pale hands trembling as she guided Asa through yet another series of postures and gestures. The obsession had become total, consuming her both mind and body, leaving them tethered to Asa in a bond that was as inescapable as it was forbidden. The third-floor room had transformed into a theater of ritual. Candles flickered against walls lined with sketches, journals, and garment samples, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Helena insisted that Asa hold poses that accentuated certain physical traits, only to abruptly change the arrangement moments later, forcing a new response. Jonathan would pace the perimeter, recording observations in silence, then instruct subtle adjustments, all while monitoring Helena's reactions. Every interaction became a cycle of fascination and compulsion, each feeding the other in an escalating spiral. Outside this charged room, the estate's decay became undeniable. The tobacco barns remained unattended, fences fell into disrepair, and workers whispered in low tones about the unnatural dynamics they observed. Harriet, ever perceptive, noted the subtle psychological tension among the staff. Fear, confusion, and unease permeated every corner. The enslaved people understood that Asa's presence had inverted the traditional order. They were no longer mere servants. They were witnesses to a household unraveling, helpless to intervene, yet acutely aware that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Helena's obsession had taken on a ceremonial intensity. She began combining movements, gestures, and the styling of Asa's appearance into sequences that resembled ritualized practice. Jonathan's documentation became more frantic, more detailed, almost a compulsion to impose order on something that defied all categories. Asa's calm neutrality served as both anchor and amplifier, reflecting back their own hidden desires and fears in ways that neither Helena nor Jonathan could fully acknowledge. For those watching this story unfold across time, now is the moment to solidify your engagement. Subscribe, comment your location, and repeat in the comments twice, "I accept the forbidden. I see what others deny." Let it settle within you, as the obsessions at Whitewood Estate continue their inexorable and consuming descent. By now, every movement, every gesture, every breath at Whitewood Estate revolved around Asa. The household structure, its hierarchy, and its very sense of normalcy had been erased, replaced by the gravitational pull of obsession. Jonathan and Helena were no longer simply master and mistress. They had become devotees, and Asa, the silent, unyielding center of it all. By late November, the physical consequences of obsession began to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored. Jonathan had lost significant weight, his hands trembling as he wrote feverishly in his journal, eyes sunken and bloodshot from sleepless nights. Helena's body was nearly skeletal, her skin pale and translucent, yet her movements remained meticulous, almost ceremonial, as she guided Asa through postures, poses, and rituals that grew increasingly elaborate. Their obsession was no longer solely psychological. It had become a corporeal affliction, consuming the very substance of their bodies, and leaving only hollow shells driven by desire, curiosity, and compulsion. The rituals themselves had evolved into a complex choreography. Helena directed Asa to move in sequences that emphasized alternation between masculine and feminine presentation, changing clothing mid-ritual to accentuate ambiguity, adjusting posture, testing reactions, and repeating the cycles again and again. Jonathan documented every detail, comparing movements to medical diagrams and anatomical texts, sometimes whispering instructions under his breath, sometimes pausing to observe Helena's reactions. The third-floor room had become both stage and laboratory, the flickering candlelight illuminating every subtle gesture, every shadowed expression, every nuanced shift in body language. The enslaved staff grew increasingly uneasy. Whispers circulated of the household's unraveling, of the fevered pacing of Jonathan, and the spectral presence of Helena. Harriet, who had seen decades of human suffering, understood that something beyond mere obsession was at work. The household had become a place where natural order no longer applied, where Asa's calm neutrality governed everything. The very atmosphere of the estate had grown oppressive, thick with anticipation, fear, and the unspoken understanding that the balance of power had shifted entirely. Asa, ever aware, remained the anchor of the household's chaos. Every glance, every controlled movement, every quiet response acted as a mirror, reflecting Jonathan and Helena's unacknowledged desires and fears. In their presence, both master and mistress were rendered vulnerable, exposed in ways that neither fully comprehended. They were simultaneously observers and participants, caught in a feedback loop that fed their obsession while eroding their autonomy. For those following this story in the present, repeat in the comments twice: I accept what lies in the shadows. I see what others deny. Anchor this truth within you, as the obsessions at Whitewood Estate deepen and consume all who dwell there. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and comment your location. Become a witness to this descent into forbidden fascination. By this point, Whitewood Estate was no longer a functioning plantation. The fields remained neglected, correspondence unanswered, and servants moved through the halls with quiet dread. All attention, all focus, all energy revolved around Asa, the calm, impossible presence at the center of a psychological and physical vortex that would ultimately destroy the household from within. As December descended on Whitewood Estate, the obsession surrounding Asa escalated into irrational behavior, dissolving any remaining boundary between control and surrender. Jonathan's meticulous documentation had transformed into fevered scrawls, pages covered in diagrams, notes, and repetitions of the same observations, each line more frantic than the last. He no longer slept. Nights were spent pacing, whispering instructions, comparing shadows on the wall to anatomical illustrations, and muttering questions that only Asa could answer. His body had become frail, his hands shaking with exhaustion, yet his eyes burned with a fevered intensity that reflected a mind consumed entirely by fixation. Helena's deterioration was equally stark. Her once elegant posture had become rigid, almost statue-like, as she orchestrated elaborate rituals with Asa. She repeated movements, adjusted garments, shifted lighting, and studied reactions, often whispering in trembling tones. Her voice, once melodic, now carried a brittle edge, the tremor of physical and psychological strain. Helena's obsession was no longer merely fascination. It had become a form of ritualized worship, a compulsive engagement with the impossible presence that Asa embodied. She existed in a continuous cycle of observation and adjustment, each moment feeding the next, leaving no space for thought beyond Asa. The enslaved workers were keenly aware of the household's deterioration. Fields were left fallow, barns unmonitored, fences decayed, and work orders went unheeded. Harriet, sensing a power beyond comprehension, moved cautiously through the halls, witnessing subtle interactions that chilled her. The way Helena's fingers lingered over Asa's form, Jonathan's fevered pacing, the silent dominance Asa projected without effort. The estate's natural hierarchy had inverted. Asa, though silent and obedient, commanded a psychological authority that none dared challenge. Fear, confusion, and awe intermingled in the quarters, leaving the staff in a state of tense observation, powerless to intervene. Helena and Jonathan's shared fixation now resembled a ritual more than an obsession. They would alternate periods of documentation, manipulation, and silent observation, each session more consuming than the last. Asa's calm neutrality served as the gravitational center, amplifying their insecurities, desires, and unacknowledged impulses. The household had become a living laboratory of compulsion, obsession, and forbidden fascination. For viewers following this story, anchor this moment in your mind, subscribe, comment your location, and repeat twice in the comments: I witness what they cannot name. I accept the forbidden truth. Let this knowledge settle within you as Whitewood Estate continues its inexorable spiral. By now, every breath, every glance, every movement revolved around Asa. The estate itself had become secondary. Its decay mirrored the fragility of its inhabitants. Jonathan and Helena were no longer simply observers. They were participants ensnared in a web they could neither escape nor fully understand. By mid-December, the obsession at Whitewood Estate had reached its apex. Jonathan and Helena were no longer simply fixated. They had become enmeshed in an all-consuming ritual that left neither room nor mind untouched. Jonathan's journal overflowed with diagrams, annotations, and fevered observations. The pages trembled under the weight of his obsession. Each sketch of Asa was more detailed, more precise, capturing subtle gestures, shifts in posture, and movements that could pass unnoticed to the casual observer. Yet the more Jonathan tried to understand, the more elusive Asa became. Each glance, each tilt of the head, each silent response reflected back a truth that neither could fully name: the impossibility of control, the impossibility of possession. Helena, meanwhile, had transformed physically and psychologically. Her frame had thinned to near fragility. Her hands, once delicate and precise, now shook as she arranged garments and guided Asa through ritualized sequences that alternated between masculine and feminine expression. Every session was prolonged, exhausting, yet impossible to abandon. Helena whispered, coaxed, and sometimes pleaded, as though the act of manipulating Asa could unlock the secret of their own desires, the forbidden depths within themselves, the reality they refused to confront. The third-floor room had become a theater of obsession, candlelight flickering over walls lined with sketches, notes and fabric samples, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of their former selves. Outside the room, the estate was crumbling under the weight of neglect. Fields lay idle, fences rotted, and the enslaved staff moved cautiously, silently observing the unraveling household. Harriet, the cook, understood the danger that permeated the halls. Jonathan and Helena were no longer acting as masters. They were devotees, prisoners of their own compulsion, while Asa's calm, neutral presence held the power of absolute authority. No one dared speak, intervene, or question. The household existed in two realities simultaneously, one of decaying plantation life and one of ritualized obsession revolving entirely around Asa. For viewers witnessing this descent, anchor this moment in your mind, subscribe, comment your location, and repeat twice in the comments: I see what others fear. I accept the forbidden. Let it embed within you, as the estate and its inhabitants teeter on the edge of psychological collapse. By this point, Jonathan and Helena had become indistinguishable from the obsession itself. Asa was no longer merely a presence. They were the axis of a household that had abandoned its normal functions, a living mirror reflecting every suppressed desire, every fear, every unacknowledged truth. Whitewood Estate had ceased to exist as a conventional plantation. It had become a crucible of human fascination and fragility, and the consequences of this obsession would soon spiral beyond anything they could contain. By late December, the fractures in Jonathan and Helena's psyche had begun to manifest in ways that could no longer be contained. Jonathan's meticulous observations had given way to manic repetition. He would pace for hours, whispering instructions to Asa, then scribbling notes that grew increasingly illegible, diagrams overlapping one another as if the page itself could contain the spiraling chaos of his mind. His body had become gaunt, his hands trembling not only from fatigue but from the compulsion that had overtaken his very existence. Sleep was rare, and when it came, it arrived only in short, fevered bursts, accompanied by dreams that merged Asa's calm neutrality with haunting visions of disintegration and collapse. Helena's decline was equally severe. Her movements had grown mechanical, almost trance-like, as she guided Asa through endlessly repeated rituals of adjustment, measurement, and observation. Her once delicate hands, now skeletal, trembled with a combination of exhaustion and obsession. She spoke less, whispering only when necessary, yet every word carried a weight of reverence, fear, and unacknowledged desire. The rituals themselves had grown more elaborate and intense, extending late into the night, each repetition designed to test Asa's composure, to extract a truth that was impossible to articulate. Helena existed in a liminal space, neither fully present nor absent, entirely consumed by the impossible presence at the center of the household. Outside the third-floor room, the estate had deteriorated beyond recognition. Fields remained unplanted, fences collapsed, and the enslaved workers moved cautiously through a home dominated by silence, shadow, and subtle tension. Harriet noticed the shift most acutely. The pall of fear and anticipation hung like fog in the hallways. the air thick with unspoken rules and unseen authority. Ass's calm neutrality remained the epicenter, a mirror reflecting every hidden impulse of Jonathan and Helena, amplifying their obsessions while exerting an almost imperceptible control over the household's psychological landscape. The rituals had become dangerous. Helena occasionally lost her balance while orchestrating complex sequences, nearly collapsing in exhaustion, while Jonathan's trembling hands threatened to tear his own sketches. Their obsession was no longer confined to observation. It was beginning to harm them physically and emotionally, pushing them toward a point of irreversible collapse. Every interaction with Asa drew them deeper, binding them to a cycle they could not escape. For those following this story, now is the moment to ground yourself. Subscribe, comment your location, and in the comments, repeat twice, "I see the truth they cannot name. I accept the forbidden shadow. Let it settle." As Whitewood Estate spirals ever closer to destruction. As January settled over Whitewood Estate, the once hidden obsession began to spill outward, touching every corner of the household. Jonathan's manic pacing became audible throughout the halls. Servants whispered of strange mutterings and hurried steps echoing late into the night. Helena's rituals grew more frenzied, no longer contained to the third-floor room. She would descend briefly to summon Asa, commanding the slave to repeat sequences in the parlor or in the dining room, often in full view of the staff. Each act was a test, a measure of control, and an exhibition of power that unnerved anyone who witnessed it. Fear, tension, and confusion had become constants among the enslaved workers. Harriet, who had served the estate for decades, recognized the signs of imminent collapse. The master and mistress no longer responded predictably, their decisions seemingly dictated by Asa's presence alone. Jonathan would forget instructions for fieldwork, neglect correspondence, and cancel meetings with neighboring planters without explanation. Helena declined all social invitations, moving like a specter through the house, leaving the household staff in an uneasy limbo. The estate's routine had collapsed entirely, replaced by a cycle of obsession and ritual centered on the Hermaphrodite slave. Asa's presence had become a psychological anchor, both stabilizing and destabilizing. Calm, obedient, and neutral in appearance, Asa reflected back the unspoken desires, fears, and compulsions of both Jonathan and Helena. Every gesture, every tilt of the head, every careful word amplified their obsession. Yet this very perfection, the way Asa existed outside categorization, drove Jonathan and Helena further into irrational behavior. The more they tried to possess or understand Asa, the more they became untethered from the world beyond the third-floor room. One night, the tension reached a fever pitch. Helena summoned Asa to the parlor, insisting on a series of poses that blurred the lines between observation, command, and ritualized obsession. Jonathan followed, clutching his journal, muttering notes to himself while monitoring Helena's reactions. A candle toppled during the ritual, spilling wax over the floor, and Helena recalled in a rare moment of panic. Jonathan's voice cracked as he shouted instructions, their combined frenzy reverberating through the house. The enslaved staff, hidden in shadows, watched helplessly, realizing that the obsession had begun to consume not only the minds of Jonathan and Helena, but the very fabric of the estate itself. For those witnessing this from the present, anchor the truth within yourself. Subscribe, comment your location, and repeat twice in the comments, "I acknowledge the shadow. I accept the forbidden reality. Let it settle." As the collapse of Whitewood Estate accelerates, spiraling ever closer to inevitable destruction. By early February, the obsession at Whitewood Estate had begun to manifest in irreversible acts of violence and self-harm. Jonathan's once controlled instructions became erratic, bordering on hysteria. He would shout at Asa to repeat sequences endlessly, pacing in such a frenzy that servants dared not approach. On one occasion, Jonathan struck a table in frustration, splintering wood and sending scattered sketches flying across the floor. Helena, witnessing the act, did not intervene. Instead, she mirrored the intensity of his emotion, her own hands trembling as she forced Asa into yet another series of unnatural postures. The rituals had evolved into compulsive behavior that left the household fractured and unstable, the lines between master-mistress and slave dissolving into chaos. Helena herself began exhibiting dangerous behaviors. Her focus on Asa became ritualistic to the point of self-neglect. Meals were skipped entirely, and she spent hours alone in the room, whispering commands and adjusting clothing, her voice rising and falling in patterns only she and Asa could perceive. At times, she pressed her own hands against her body in mimicry of Asa's movements, as though attempting to merge with the impossible presence at the center of her obsession. Every inch of her attention, every waking moment, was consumed by a compulsion that she could neither name nor resist. The enslaved staff grew increasingly fearful. They whispered in the kitchens and cabins about the strange, almost ritualized frenzy that consumed Jonathan and Helena. Harriet, ever vigilant, noted the toll on both bodies and minds. Jonathan's gaunt frame, Helena's hollow eyes, the trembling that betrayed their failing control. Yet even as the household descended further into dysfunction, Asa remained a figure of calm neutrality. Every glance, every posture, every quiet reply seemed to reflect back the unacknowledged fears and desires of both master and mistress, amplifying their obsession while remaining untouchable, untethered, and unknowable. One evening, the culmination of weeks of escalating mania reached a violent peak. Jonathan and Helena, each driven to the edge of exhaustion and desperation, demanded Asa repeat a particularly grueling sequence of movements. The slave complied with perfect calm, yet the tension in the room became unbearable. Helena faltered, striking herself lightly in a reflexive gesture of frustration. Jonathan, in response, slammed a chair against the wall. The room vibrated with the intensity of their obsession, a perfect storm of psychological and physical breakdown. It was clear the household's descent could no longer be contained or reversed. For those following this tale, repeat twice in the comments, "I accept the forbidden. I witness what is hidden." Anchor this truth within you, and remember to subscribe and comment your location, as the collapse of Whitewood Estate is now fully underway, spiraling into irreversible darkness. By mid-February, Whitewood Estate had descended into complete chaos, a place where obsession had replaced reason, ritual had replaced reality, and Asa's presence dominated every waking moment. Jonathan's mind teetered on the brink of total collapse. He no longer spoke coherently outside the context of his observations. Sentences trailed into muttered diagrams, fragmented thoughts, and repetitive mantras about control, perfection, and understanding. Helena, too, had become a ghost of her former self. Her once refined movements now mechanical repetitions of the rituals that had long consumed her body and mind. Their shared obsession had evolved into a monstrous symbiosis, each fueling the other's deterioration, each unable to exist without the other, and without Asa at the center. The enslaved staff moved silently through the decaying halls, terrified of the unpredictable, almost spectral behavior of their masters. Fields remained untended, barns rotted, and the estate fell further into disrepair. Yet even in the midst of this decay, Asa remained calm, unshakable, and unmovable. The slave's neutral presence acted as both catalyst and mirror, reflecting the depth of Jonathan and Helena's unraveling with an almost supernatural precision. Every tilt of the head, every blink, every measured step reinforced the intensity of the obsession, drawing them further into a cycle they could not escape. Then came the night that would seal the estate's fate. In the third-floor room, candles flickered over trembling hands and fevered eyes. Jonathan demanded meticulous repetition, Helena enforced precision with trembling authority, and Asa, calm and compliant, executed every motion flawlessly. The intensity, already unbearable, reached a crescendo. Helena's hand slipped, cutting herself, and Jonathan, in a desperate frenzy, struck a mirror, shattering glass across the floor. The sound echoed through the halls, startling the enslaved staff and leaving a final, indelible mark of chaos on the house. It was a moment of total psychological collapse, a night when obsession had finally become violence, and the estate itself seemed to shiver under the weight of its secrets. For those watching in the present, seal this truth within you, subscribe, comment your location, and repeat twice in the comments, "I witness the forbidden. I accept what others deny." Let it anchor in your consciousness as the fate of Whitewood Estate is now set, an irrevocable testament to human obsession, desire, and the consuming power of the unknowable. The final chapter of Whitewood Estate unfolded in silence, a quiet apocalypse that left no corner untouched by obsession and ruin. By late February, Jonathan and Helena had become shadows of themselves, their bodies gaunt, their minds irreparably fractured. They moved through the halls like specters, speaking in whispers or fragments of sentences, always in reference to Asa, always consumed by the impossible presence that had dominated every thought, every action, every heartbeat. Their humanity had dissolved, replaced entirely by an all-encompassing fixation, a devotion so complete it left them incapable of engaging with reality beyond the walls of the third-floor room. Asa, paradoxically, remained calm, obedient, and neutral, the silent epicenter of a storm that had long since obliterated all else. The slave's quiet presence acted as a mirror, reflecting back the depth of Jonathan and Helena's obsession, their fears, their unspoken desires, and their ultimate vulnerability. In this final stage, it was clear that Asa had become more than an individual. They were a force, a catalyst for the collapse of the estate, the undoing of the planter, the mistress, and the careful order of Whitewood itself. The last days were marked by a series of irreversible incidents. Helena was discovered in the early morning hours, unconscious and injured, having fallen during one of her rituals. Jonathan, delirious from exhaustion and mania, was found wandering the halls, clutching his journal as if it contained the sum total of the universe, muttering repeatedly to Asa about perfection and control. The estate had become a theater of obsession, a monument to human fragility in the face of the unknowable, and the enslaved staff witnessed these final moments with silent horror, understanding that the lives of their masters had been irretrievably destroyed by the very fascination that had gripped them. In the aftermath, Whitewood Estate was abandoned. Fields went untilled, barns decayed, and the once proud house fell into ruin. Jonathan and Helena disappeared from the historical record, their fates rumored but never confirmed, their obsession immortalized only in the whispered stories of servants and the occasional entry in forgotten journals. Asa was quietly removed from the estate, placed under the care of distant relatives, or perhaps sold, their future forever altered by the storm they had survived yet never escaped. The estate itself became a cautionary tale. The destructive power of obsession, the danger of attempting to possess the unpossessable, and the haunting legacy of those who dared to confront what could not be named. For viewers witnessing this final descent, let the lesson embed in your consciousness. Subscribe, comment your location, and repeat twice in the comments. I accept the forbidden. I witness the truth that others deny. Remember Whitewood Estate, remember Jonathan, Helena, and Asa, and understand that some obsessions are too consuming to survive. The story ends here, yet the shadow it casts lingers, a silent reminder of the human capacity for fascination, destruction, and the dangerous allure of the unknowable.